Welcome to the fifth in our series of Forming Our Conscience, Practicing Our Faith in a World of Gray. As I mentioned, my name is Father John Whitney, and on behalf of St. Ignatius Parish and the many people who've contributed to this series, I want to thank you for being here in this virtual space this morning for some of us, this afternoon for others, I'm sure. Today, we continue our exploration of some of today's crucial moral issues with Father James Martin of the Society of Jesus, who will be addressing issues around LGBTQ communities in the church and society. For those of you who may be new to this series, just to explain our process, Father Martin will offer his presentation, then we'll take some time for personal reflection with some questions that Father Martin has put together. Then we'll take some group time for discussion. We'll go into small groups. You'll be assigned to a room. We invite you to go to this breakout room and talk about your own reflections, your own thinking. We will then come back after about 20 minutes to the large group and invite you to say, is there something you heard, a key word, a key phrase that we might gather together and put on the chat and share with each other? And then we go back to and when we're back in the large group and we see that, then we'll ask Father Martin to give a final response. And if all that's confusing, don't worry, because I will shepherd us through that. But right now, I want to make sure that we turn to Father James Martin. As I mentioned, Father Martin is a member of the Society of Jesus. He is editor-in-large for the Jesuit magazine, America. He is best known as an author for his many books and articles, including The Jesuit Guide to Practically Everything, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, My Life with the Saints, Learning to Pray, a Guide for Everyone, and perhaps most relevant today, Building a Bridge, Hope for the Catholic Church and the LGBT community. There are many other books and articles, which I won't go into since we only have an hour and a half. But in 2017, he was appointed by Pope Francis to the Vatican Secretariat for Communications. I want to turn this over to Father Martin, but he is a great articulator of our vision, of the vision of the Society of Jesus, of the vision of the Church, with a great deal of hope. And so without further ado, I just want to turn it over. Thank you, Jim, for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John. Wonderful to be with you. I'm really honored to be invited to St. Ignatius Parish. I'm happy to be in San Francisco, even virtually. I see my Jesuit brothers there. I want to say hi, especially to John Coleman, who helped me during my tertianship, the final stage of Jesuit formation. And John, that was in 2007. I can't believe it. So wonderful to be with all of you. Wonderful to be at the parish. I visited there several times, and it's just a wonderful place. Why don't we begin with a prayer, since we're talking about conscience and the way that God works within us. Should take a moment and remember that we're in God's presence when we gather together, even virtually. Loving God, we thank you for bringing us together as your church, as your community. On this feast of Christ the King, we remember that Jesus was always a servant to the will of the Father and to obedience to his own conscience, which was so united to that of the Father's. Help us to be open in our own hearts and minds to the workings of the Holy Spirit in our lives as well. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So first of all, I want to give a caveat as I talk about conscience. I am not a theologian. The Jesuits on this call know that. And so I'm going to give you a somewhat imperfect overview of how I see conscience and how it relates to LGBTQ people. So there's 5 parts of my little talk today. Hopefully I'll get through them all. One is conscience and its recovery in our current day. Second is conscience and Jesuit spirituality. Third is conscience in the everyday life of LGBTQ people. Fourth is LGBT Catholics and church teaching. And fifth is my own discernment in the ministry that I've been doing with LGBT people. So to begin with, now you may have heard this in other talks in this series, But the final arbiter of the moral life is an informed conscience, a well-formed conscience. What does that mean? That means a conscience that understands the Gospels, that understands church teaching, okay? And in the New Testament, when we read about knowing something in our hearts, we're going all the way back to Jesus, of course. The word in Greek is cardia, heart. He's speaking about conscience, or we're speaking about conscience. So a little quote from the first letter of John. Don't worry, I'm not going to quote too much today. And by this we will know that we are from the truth and will reassure our hearts before him whenever our hearts condemn us, for God is greater than our hearts, and God knows everything. Beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have boldness before God. Okay, so what the writer is speaking about is our conscience, knowing something in our heart. The connection also of conscience with heart is an important one because it reminds us of the need to connect conscience with others. So it's not just about us, okay, with our treatment of others. So the well-formed conscience is the final arbiter of our moral life. For St. Thomas Aquinas, a theologian that many other theologians like to quote, a conscience binds us, even when conscience is in error, right? And so Thomas Aquinas famously said that he would rather go against church teaching than to go against his conscience. The Second Vatican Council's document Dignitatis Humanae said, I'm going to use inclusive language, men and women must not be forced to act contrary to their consciences. Conscience is a person's most secret core and their sanctuary. This is one of my favorite quotes. There, the person is alone with God, whose voice echoes in their depths. Now, as I said, you may have heard this already in the series. One of the things I want to speak about this afternoon is how Catholics are surprised when they hear that. When I tell people that your conscience, an informed conscience, is the final arbiter of the moral life, people think I'm just sort of making it up, or I'm being a Jesuit. Anything goes. But this is traditional Catholic theology. So why don't we know it? Why are Catholics so surprised? Well, we had that quote from the Second Vatican Council. I think what has happened is, and this is not to blame anybody or to denigrate anybody, is that during the papacies of St. John Paul II and Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, that teaching, I think, was really sort of shunted aside, right? And so the idea that people would have a conscience that could inform them was really downplayed. You didn't hear very much about conscience. I mean, they certainly didn't deny it, but it was more about following the rules and the regulations of the Catholic Church. All right. And so now what has happened is that conscience has been kind of pushed aside, and that when you bring it up, you are seen as somehow going against church teaching. But I just want to start off by saying that this is in fact church teaching, and we will see in a little bit how this has been recovered. Now, I would say that Jesuit spirituality, or more broadly, Ignatian spirituality, has really never lost this idea of the primacy of conscience. And here in Jesuit spirituality, and I'm sure most of you have all had exposure at your parish to Jesuit spirituality, maybe have done retreats, maybe yourselves are spiritual directors, conscience is closely linked to what happens in prayer. Okay, so when we talk about God's activity in our lives, it's not simply the right and the wrong, okay, which is important, of course, but it is how God is active in our prayer life and in our daily life. Okay, and one of the key insights in Jesuit spirituality is that the Holy Spirit is at work in each person. One of the things that got St. Ignatius in trouble with the Inquisition, John probably knows this better, I think he was jailed 3 times, was the idea that the Creator would deal directly with the creature. Okay, so that God, the Creator, can deal directly with us, with the creature. Which at the time was really frustrating for some of the religious authorities who said that no, it had to always come through the church, right? The church always had to mediate that. But again, this is central to Catholic teaching. So the Holy Spirit is at work in each person. How could you do spiritual direction without understanding that, without believing that? How could you do any sort of spiritual direction without reverencing the working of the Holy Spirit? And this is why in the life of the spiritual director, he sometimes or she sometimes has to step back. I'll tell you a story from my own experience. I have over many years, maybe the last 30 years, I've been a spiritual director, and from time to time, I direct people, sometimes over long stretches of time, with people that I don't agree with. Certainly their political views from time to time, but even their theological views. Right. And I've had young Jesuits who have come to me, and I don't agree with everything they say, right, and the way they look at the church. And just recently, I had a Jesuit come to me, I will not break confidence. And he was, I would say, participating in something that, nothing sinful, of course, but something that I just didn't agree with. And, I have to reverence the Holy Spirit working in him, right? So it's about taking seriously the fact that the Holy Spirit is at work in the person. Now, we talk about Jesuit spirituality. I think this is one way of understanding the synod. I'm not going to go too far afield on this, but the synod of bishops, which Paul VI started or sort of renovated, I would say, at the behest of the Second Vatican Council. The synod of bishops really had gone on ever since the Second Vatican Council. They met for all sorts of different reasons. But in a sense, some of the outcomes of the synod were more or less preordained. Okay, because in synods in the past, in a sense, people kind of knew where they were going. But Pope Francis has really rejuvenated the idea of synod by focusing again on this idea of conscience. One of the things he said in the synod on the family was, let no one say that no one can talk about this. Okay, because, as a Jesuit, as a former novice director, as a former spiritual director, as a former provincial, right? He understands the primacy of conscience and the relevance, the importance of listening to the Holy Spirit at work, not only in the individual, but in the church, among the faithful. So, and one way you see the pushback on that, the pushback against conscience, is in the document Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, which was, one of my favorite words in the Catholic Church, the post-synodal apostolic exhortation of Pope Francis after the Synod on the Family. And one of the footnotes, I think it's in section 8 in Amoris Laetitia, is about divorced and remarried Catholics. And in that footnote, he talks about people who are divorced and remarried using their consciences, along with consultation from pastors, to decide whether or not they're going to present themselves in the communion line. And what you saw was this kind of firestorm of criticism from people. And it really, to me, revealed what I would say is the fundamental difference between Pope Francis and his opponents. When you go beneath the political stuff, the sociological stuff, the ecclesiological stuff, the theological stuff, you get to the spiritual stuff. And I truly believe that the primary difference between Pope Francis and his opponents, when you go down in almost every case, is this respect for conscience, right? And Pope Francis truly believes that in the individual and in the church and among the faithful, that the Holy Spirit is active. And I really believe that many of his opponents don't look at it that way. And so that's why when Pope Francis talks about the use of conscience in Amoris Laetitia, right, he gets this pushback. People say, oh, that means anything goes. No, it doesn't. Not at all. It means that he trusts in noticing where the Holy Spirit is at work. Okay. So that's kind of an overview of conscience and where we've been and where we are, especially with Pope Francis's recent emphasis on it. As I say, I believe it comes out of his Jesuit background, among other places. What about conscience? Let's turn to conscience in the life of the LGBT person, okay? Now, how do we understand conscience in the life of the LGBT person? Well, I would say the way that we understand it in the life of any human being, right? LGBT people have consciences like anybody else. To begin with, it helps us know right and wrong. Okay, we don't often talk about it, but sin is important here. It's important to talk about sin. A good deal of conscience is knowing when you sin. I certainly have that experience. I feel uneasy. I feel sometimes it's hard to sleep if I feel that I've sinned against someone, especially if I've been mean in any way or thoughtless. The beginning of the Mass, I'm sure you've all been to Mass already, is the penitential rite. We begin with that part of the Mass. So good and evil, right and wrong. But also more broadly, conscience helps us to listen to our heart. There's that word again, cardia, and try to figure out where God is leading us. All right, so it's not just about right and wrong. It's also about what Ignatius would call the movements of the Spirit. And one of the key insights for Ignatian spirituality is that by listening to the movements of our spirit, we can get a sense of where God wants us to go. So God not only wants us to make good decisions, but the great insight of Ignatian spirituality, Ignatius didn't come up with this, but he certainly popularized it, is that God will help us make good decisions. Now, how are we able to access that? Well, I can't sum up all of Jesuit spirituality in a few minutes, but essentially it's about discernment. And Ignatius says that for people that are trying to go on the right path, and I think that's probably most of us here, for people who are trying to lead good lives, the good spirit and the spirit that moves us away from God. And when he's talking about spirits, by the way, Ignatius, is talking about the evil one or Satan. But I think an easier way to understand this is sort of impulses that come from within us and also come from outside of us, people that tell us things and things that we read. So when we think about the good spirit and the bad spirit, think about them as impulses or movements. And we all know that there's a battle going on inside of us where we can all feel that, doing good things, doing bad things, sort of moving in the direction of God, moving away from that. In any event, the good spirit, Ignatius says, builds us up, consoles us, gives us a sense of hope, right? Removes obstacles. The bad spirit, the spirit that moves us away from God, generally speaking, moves us into despair, causes what St. Ignatius calls gnawing anxiety. Okay, so when we think of those things, for example, during the pandemic, one shorthand way I was trying to help people during the pandemic is this: any voices that are coming from within you, any impulses that lead you to hope, that lead you to say, I can handle this, lead you to say, there's better times ahead, I can handle this, are coming from God. Voices of hope are coming from God. Anything that says this is hopeless, this is despairing, nothing's ever going to change, that kind of voice is not coming from God. So it's discerning, Ignatius says, between the good spirit and the bad spirit in our lives. And this is for LGBTQ people as well as for anybody else. Some other insights from Ignatius is that when we are in a good place, when we are sort of moving in the right direction, Ignatius says that the good spirit will act like the drop of water on a sponge, very gently. Kind of go on, you're doing a great job. You can do it. Very gentle, keep it up. You're doing fine. The bad spirit will act like a drop of water on a stone. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. This is terrible. I get this feeling of panic, right? So in these ways, in these sort of techniques and insights, Ignatius enables us to find our way and listen to, God's voice within us, which again is our conscience. He also says sometimes a little recherche example: the angel of darkness can appear as the angel of light, right? So what does that mean? That means that we have to test out things that on the surface may seem like they're good. So for example, let's say I had an idea that, I needed some rest today. And it's good to want rest, right? Want rest. And so I think I'll cancel this talk with St. Ignatius Parish because I need rest. Okay, I see John laughing. That's the angel of darkness appearing as the angel of light. In other words, on the face of it, it sounds good. Yeah, I need rest. I mean, that's a good thing. But it's kind of using that sort of false appearance to get me to do something bad that would hurt people. Okay. So these are the movements of the spirit that Ignatius talks about that can help us in our discernment, in our looking at conscience. Now, conscience is not infallible. The Second Vatican Council's Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World reminds us that we frequently err. We're not perfect, right? I sin too. But we can get to the truth only through conscience. I'll quote something from Jim Keenan, which I like. Humility then is constitutive of the Christian quest for moral truth, because in truth we are always learning and opening ourselves to correction. Okay? For Catholics, this process is assisted by prayerful participation in the life of the church particularly by attention to preaching of God's word and the sacrament. So we always have to be open to the fact that we might be wrong, right? Okay, so that's a little précis of Ignatius and conscience, which is sort of understanding it as the working of God within us, okay, and discerning right and wrong, but also trying to see where God is leading us. Okay, now let's look more specifically at LGBT Catholics and church teaching. Okay, this is especially important because oftentimes people say, and it's very, I think, reductive, well, you can't do X, Y, Z because that's against church teaching. Okay, oftentimes LGBT teaching about LGBT, and I can say I'm using LGBT, but I mean LGBTQ or whatever acronym you're comfortable with. If you're listening from Canada, 2S LGBTQ. Often people reduce Catholic teaching on LGBTQ people to a few lines in the Catechism, to numbers 2357 to 2359, which talks about homosexuality. But we have to understand that there is a deeper level to church teaching when we're thinking about using our consciences, and that is the Gospels. It's encountering Jesus in the Gospels, and it's meeting a Jesus who reaches out to people on the margins. So briefly put, I want to look at very briefly 3 Gospel passages that I find helpful to help us understand Jesus's outreach to people on the margins. Very briefly, I could go on for much longer. The first is the Roman centurion. Okay, now you know the story of Jesus meeting the Roman centurion. I know we're all of a certain age here. If you've seen Franco Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth, I'm talking about Ernest Borgnine. He plays the Roman centurion in Capernaum. I see people laughing. In Capernaum, Jesus meets the Roman centurion, who asks for healing for his servant. And he says, but you don't have to come to my house because I'm a man with people under my authority. I say, come, and someone comes. I say, go to another, and he goes. I say, do this, and he does. And Jesus says, never in Israel have I seen faith like this. Okay, and the man's servant is healed. By the way, interestingly, notice that he's the one we quote every Sunday, or for some of us every day. Not Mary or Saint Joseph, but the outsider. All right. Now, what's the traditional interpretation of that story? The traditional interpretation of that story is that Jesus has the power to heal illness, which is true. Another way of looking at it is that Jesus's word does what it says. All right. Notice that Jesus doesn't have to, do some sort of magic incantation a la Harry Potter or have some potion, or he just says, your servant is healed. In fact, in this case, he doesn't even say it, the servant's healed. Okay, no, excuse me, he does. He says, for saying that, you may go. So Jesus's word does what it says, just like God's word in the book of Genesis, right? When God says, let there be light, there's light. So it's the efficacy of Jesus's word and the power of Jesus over illness. Okay, so that's certainly the traditional explanation of the Roman centurion. But there's another part of that story that we don't want to overlook. This man is almost completely outside of Jesus's circle. Okay, he's not Jewish. Now, the people in Capernaum tell Jesus to be kind to him because he built the synagogue. You can still see that synagogue today, the ruins. But this is a man who's not Jewish. He's not Jewish. He's not monotheistic. If he's a Roman, he most likely believes in multiple Roman gods, right? He probably carries around little household gods or idols, right? And so this is someone who is completely outside of Jesus's world. Now but notice how Jesus treats this person who feels like he's on the margins. Does he castigate him? Does he say, I'm not going to speak to you because you're not Jewish? Does he call him a sinner? No. He listens to him and treats him with what the Catechism calls respect, compassion, and sensitivity. He gives him a great gift, and then he praises his faith. I sometimes think about LGBTQ people, who persevere in the church, and I'm sure you know many of them, how great their faith is, right? Sometimes fired from different institutions. How great is their faith? All right, so it's an early sign of how Jesus treats people on the margins. Why am I bringing this up? Because this is church teaching too. And to have a well-formed conscience as an LGBTQ person or as an ally is to know this part of church teaching as well. The second story I like to look at is the story of the woman at the well. So Jesus is going through Samaria. As you know, that the Samaritans and the Jews at the time were at odds, mainly about where the place to worship God was. For the Jews, it was the temple in Jerusalem. For the Samaritans, it was Mount Gerizim. So Jesus is going through Samaria, and it's noon. Now, why do we care that it's noon? Well, there's a woman there. Well, why do we care that there's a woman at noon there? Well, when I worked in East Africa for 2 years, I used to see people lining up at the water pump, women almost exclusively, to fill their what were called jerry cans, to fill their big plastic containers with water in the morning, because that was when it was the coolest. Why would a woman be there at 12 noon, the hottest part of the day? She's been ostracized. She's been excluded for her life of what you might say is an irregular sexual history. She's been married 5 times, and now she's with a woman who's not her husband. She's ostracized for her sexual behavior. All right. Jesus comes upon her. There's 3 reasons he shouldn't be talking to her by rights. First, she's a woman. Second, she's from Samaria. And third, she has this background. What does Jesus do? Jesus engages her in one of the longest conversations in the Gospels, a long back and forth. He listens to her. He listens to her story. And then he reveals himself to her as the living water. You know, she says, of course, he says, I have water that if you drink of it, you'll never be thirsty again. And she thinks, well, of course, I don't want to come to this well all the time. Give me that water. And I am the living water. And then he commissions her to spread the good news. She leaves behind her water jug. The New Testament scholar Sandra Schneiders compares her leaving behind of her empty water jug to Peter's leaving behind of his nets, right? She's commissioned. She's an apostle. Apostle means being sent. She's sent to the Samaritans to proclaim the good news. Now, what's the traditional way of looking at that story? Well, that Jesus is the living water, one of the great I am statements in John's gospel, okay? But there's another part of that story. Look how Jesus treats someone who is on the margins because of her sexual history. Does he call her a sinner? Does he say, I'm not going to talk to you? No. He reveals himself to her. He does her a great favor, right? He reveals himself to her. He commissions her, and he commissions her to spread the good news. Again, this what Pope Francis would call a culture of encounter. Okay. Finally, the third story is the story of Zacchaeus. And in that story, Jesus, as you know, in the Gospel of Luke, is going through Jericho, and he meets the chief tax collector. Now, the chief tax collector at the time would have been seen as the chief sinner in the area. Okay. Now, I'd like you to think of Zacchaeus as an emblem for the LGBT person. Zacchaeus is described as, not because LGBT people are any more sinful than anyone else, we're all sinful, right? But because he is excluded. Zacchaeus is described as short in stature. How little stature do LGBTQ people have in our church? Then we're told he could not see on account of the crowd. Now, obviously, it's because he's physically short. But how often does the crowd get in the way of the LGBT person and an encounter with Jesus? So what does he do? He has to climb the sycamore tree, something embarrassing, right? Probably invited ridicule. He has to do something extra, like the LGBT person often has to do, just to do what everybody else is doing, which is to see Jesus. Jesus comes through to Jericho. It's a big town. He has a big crowd with him. It's the end of his ministry, and he points to Zacchaeus and says, hurry down, I must stay at your house tonight. It's a public sign of welcome. Zacchaeus comes down the tree with joy. Again, how often does the person who's excluded, how often are they joyful when they're finally welcomed? And then it says Zacchaeus stood his ground. The Greek is stathes, not just stand, but he stood his ground, because all in the crowd began to grumble. All who saw it began to grumble. An extension of mercy to those in the margins always makes some people angry. And then something wonderful happens that, believe it or not, now maybe some of you already know this, but I just found this out a couple of weeks ago. Now, the traditional, the translation that we use is, what Zacchaeus says next is, if I have defrauded anyone, I will repay them 4 times over. And I will give half my money to the poor. But if you look at scripture scholars, including Joe Fitzmyer in the Anchor Bible series, and Luke Timothy Johnson in the Sacropagina series, that's not right. It's in the present tense. I am giving half of my money to the poor, and if I defraud anyone, I do repay them 4 times over. That story is usually used as a kind of conversion experience, you know, that an encounter with Jesus promises conversion. But what is happening is that Jesus is revealing to the crowd that this man who is being seen as excluded is already doing something generous. I am giving half my money to the poor. So on that, again, there is this experience of Jesus meeting someone who's on the margins, reaching out to them, treating them again with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. So these are all things that we have to understand about church teaching. It's not just the catechism, right? We have to look at Bible verses about homosexuality. Of course, we have to understand them in their context, right? But we also have to understand church teaching as not just a book, but a person. And when LGBT people are thinking about church teaching, they have to look at 3 things. 1, the Gospels and an encounter with Jesus in the Gospels, that Jesus we were just talking about. 2, tradition and the catechism, including the Bible and verses in the Bible. And 3, their conscience. Again, the final arbiter of the moral life. And by the way, when we look at verses from the Bible about homosexuality, we have to remember how often we become fundamentalists. Often people point to things from Leviticus, right? And I say to people, all right, well, if you think you want to look at Leviticus and take it literally, do you think that people should be stoned to death for taking the name of the Lord in vain? They said, well, of course not. Well, why not? That's in Leviticus. Well, I understand that differently now. Do you think people should be killed for adultery? No, of course not. Well, then why not? Well, we understand that differently. So we need to look at the verses about homosexuality in that same context, you know, not brushing them aside, but understanding them in their context. That's part of being an educated Catholic. That's part of having an informed conscience. Okay. Now, one of the things, and I don't want to go on too long, I might skip my own personal history at the end. Maybe we can talk about that later. But I do want to give enough time for comments and questions and your time for prayer. One of the things I want to talk about is why LGBT people are singled out in the church. And why does it seem that their consciences don't matter as much? Okay, when we think about a less fraught analogy, a less fraught comparison, we know that there are many married couples in the church, in the Catholic Church, who have, in their own consciences and thinking about church teaching and their encounter with Christ, have made a decision about birth control. You know, in fact, I would say probably the majority of Catholic couples use in some form birth control. Why is it that they're not singled out? Why is it that the church seems to trust their consciences? Why is there no talk about them being denied communion constantly? You know, why is this not a topic in the bishops' conference? Well, I think because we know them. Okay, the church knows mainly, the church knows, I would say, a great number of obviously married straight couples. And so priests and bishops and Catholic leaders and teachers tend to say, well, I know that they are struggling with their consciences in the complexity of their lives. And yet, LGBT people are not afforded, as far as I can see, that same respect. So I think one of the things for the church to do is to get to know LGBTQ people as real people, as people who have consciences, right? And whose decisions we have to respect. Okay, so very briefly, I'm going to talk about the last thing, which is my own discernment in this ministry, my own conscience. So I started really doing this kind of ministry in earnest in 2016 after the Pulse nightclub massacre. And maybe this will be a little bit of a kind of an object lesson, or how at least how I tried to use conscience. At the very beginning of this journey for me, in June of 2016, the Pulse nightclub massacre happened, and I was really angry, obviously, and upset. 49 people were killed in what was then the largest mass shooting in U.S. history that has unfortunately since been surpassed. And I did a Facebook video because I was disappointed that more bishops, that hardly any bishops said anything in terms of condolence or sympathy for LGBTQ people. And and what came to my conscience, into my heart, was the phrase, even in death, this community is invisible to the church. I was very angry. And in my conscience, I want to just share with you, I had to discern, am I angry? Is this a kind of selfish anger, or is this a healthy anger? Is this a kind of righteous anger? And I thought, well, this is on behalf of the community. It's not about me. And so I posted a Facebook video that, as they say, went viral. All right. I was then invited to give a talk at New Ways Ministry. And in my conscience, I had to ask for permission. This is all sort of weighing things. Ask for permission of my Jesuit superiors. Now, I could have just gone on and done it because I thought, oh, this is the right thing to do. But I knew that as a Jesuit, I'd taken a vow of obedience, and I knew that my conscience would not let me do that. My conscience would not let me ignore the advice and the orders of my Jesuit superiors. So at each stage of my ministry, which I do with many other people, I've asked for permission. And so that's my conscience. That's how I use my conscience. Another way of using conscience has come up in a lot of the hateful comments that I get. Since I wrote the book in 2017 and I started doing this ministry, I can't even say the words that people have said to me. I mean, homophobic terms and people attacking me, and in my conscience, I would very much I'm very much tempted to just like spout off and say terrible things. I mean, I'm a human being, right? I want to just say horrible things back to these people, but I can't, because my conscience tells me that's not the right thing to do. And also in my discernment with my superiors, with my spiritual director, I realized that impulse is not coming from God. That impulse to be, to kind of give it back in kind is not coming from God. Pope Francis has helped me a great deal with this. I also feel, this is more personal sharing, if I engage that darkness, I find it very desolating. The few times that I've actually, gone toe to toe with people who are really mean and cruel, I think there's where we have to restore to our theological dictionary, mean. Because a lot of this is not theological or ecclesiological, or it's people are just mean and homophobic. When I engage in this, I do feel a sense of desolation. And so I have to pull back from that. And then finally, I would say in terms of conscience, it's always what to share and what not to share. I can say that, recently over the past couple of years, I've been in touch with the Pope. But I don't always share what he tells me. So there's conscience there too. Like, because I sense that sometimes he'd like me to share things, sometimes he wouldn't like me to share things. So I guess, I know that sounds like it doesn't all hang together. Like those are several things: dealing with anger, dealing with superiors, dealing with hateful comments, and trying to figure out when the Pope wants me to share something. But truly, it's all conscience. It's all conscience. It's all discernment. And I really do trust it. I talk to my spiritual director and my superiors, but it's continuing discernment for me. So it's 12:10 where you are, 3:10 where I am. I'm going to finish. So to review, I know Europeans love doing this. We've talked about conscience and its recovery after the Second Vatican Council, and Pope Francis sort of focusing on it. Conscience in Jesuit spirituality, the idea that the Holy Spirit is at work in each person. Conscience in the everyday life of LGBTQ people, which is really like conscience in the life of most people, listening to the movements of the Spirit. LGBT Catholics and church teaching, where I argued that church teaching is not just those few lines in the catechism. Church teaching is the person of Christ. And finally, my own discernment and my own use of conscience in this ministry. So I'm sorry I went over for a little bit, but I hope this has been helpful for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jim. I want to thank you not just for your teaching about conscience, but your modeling of it. And I appreciate that very much. I think I speak for others. So now what we're going to what we're going to be doing is moving into some personal reflection time. We're going to take about 3 or 4 minutes. We have some questions we're going to put up, I think, that Jim put together. My technical advisor will put up the questions. There we are. And just to ask you individually to take some time to mute your audio and think about these questions yourself, or whatever is coming to your mind. Here are some questions to sort of spark that reflection about what you've heard and what you're feeling. And then in about, let's say 12:14, we'll say, well, you'll be invited to go into some small groups to have a conversation. And I really invite people to go to these groups and share their own feelings. Our one guideline for these groups are not led by anyone, but our guideline is that everyone speaks once before anyone speaks a second time, so that everyone has a chance to speak what's on their heart or in their mind. And then after about 20 minutes in the small groups, we'll invite you to come back and offer some words or phrases that you may have heard that moved you. So right now, just take the next 3 minutes for reflection. And I'm going to get off and be quiet.